Hello, everybody. Welcome to this talk on coccidiosis. We're talking about risk assessment and targeted control. I'm Fiona Lovatt. I live up in the northeast of England, and sheep are my thing. So this is coccidiosis in lambs. So we know we've got 15 different types of cocci that affect sheep, but only 2 of those are pathogenic in the UK. So that's Eimeria ovinoidalis and Eimeria crandalis, and that PPP, the pre-patent period, 12 to 20 days for both of them. So the cocci, massive damage to the cells lining the gut, causing diarrhea, straining, pain loss. You can see this lamb here, just really painful abdomen, and often they're really straining at the anus, and often we lose the lambs. But apart from that, the obvious clinical signs, you get subclinical disease and poor weight gain. So when we look at the life cycle of cocci, it's hideously complicated. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but basically it's in 2 stages. It's in 3 stages. We've got the area inside the gut, and then that's in the ileum, the cecum, and the colon for both crandalis and ovinoidalis. In the gut cells, you can see why the gut cells themselves get really damaged. All this area at the top in blue is what happens within the gut of the sheep. And the second part of the life cycle also happens in that. So the first part where you get, I can't even say these words, schizogony, and then the gametogony, so that's like the sort of sexual reproduction, all that's happening in the gut, but what the outcome of it is these oocysts. And then we've got the third part of the life cycle, which happens in the environment. So what we've got outside, once you've got an oocyst outside an environment, they're really very, very difficult to get rid of. They've got very hard exterior shell, they can survive for years, and that's why we often see cocci places on farms where actually those oocysts have survived. So what's going on in the environment with the oocysts, and they don't sporulate, and it depends on oxygen levels, humidity levels, and temperature levels. I thought it was just worth, so that's about the most detail I was going to go into the life cycle, but it's really worth thinking about what can kill those unsporulated oocysts in the environment. And there are disinfectants which are suitable, but not a standard disinfectant or a standard bleach. So these are just some trade names. But you do definitely need to make sure that it's going to kill cocci. And it's pretty, so ammonia hydroxide is great, but it actually needs a 10% solution, and that needs to be for a good 45 minutes. So otherwise, there's a variety of trade names, Kilcock Extra, Coxisol, Cyclex, but you do definitely need to check on it, what's in the ingredients, and will it kill cocci in the shed. So that's the unsporulated oocysts that are really, really difficult to kill. And when we look at what's happening in the gut, we can see here on the picture on the left, these are normal villi. Really, as you know, inside a gut, you need to have the villi to have a massive surface area to cause absorption. And what happens when cocci gets in there and you've got that life cycle in the gut going on, it really damages the villi and the crypts. So not only are the villi massively reduced in height, but the crypts also are pretty much non-existent. So you don't have this same surface area, and that's why you get the diarrhea that you see. And this graph just shows you where the pre-patent period is, and how you get an increase in the output of oocysts when that happens, oocyst excretion, and when you get the diarrhea. But the pre-patent period is, as I said before, between 12 and 20 days, depending on whether you've got ovinoidalis or crandalis. So that's quite useful to see. The main risk factors we get for cocci in lambs is either that you've got a really high oocyst challenge? Well, it's a combination of a really high oocyst challenge alongside susceptible lambs. So a high challenge could be that there's muck going into the food or water supply, and so you're getting that recirculation of oocysts. As they go into the animal, there's a massive multiplication in the gut, and then the animal will put out loads more oocysts than they've taken in. So any dirty conditions, if they're very heavily stocked, and this crucial, and I'll explain this as we go on, if we've had older lambs previously in that field, that's going to be a high challenge, and it's going to coincide with very susceptible lambs because they haven't built up immunity alongside that large number of eggs. So susceptible lambs, it could be 3 to 12 weeks, so 3-4 weeks, definitely no younger than 3 weeks, but 3 to 12 weeks falls a bit just slightly older than sometimes when it's really bad, we see it younger. We actually see it getting worse in younger lambs as we go through the season. We'd never see it in a 3-week-old lamb at the start of lambing, but we might do by the end of lambing. And that's a really important point to remember, that 1 year somebody might have got to the end of lambing and started to have to treat animals at 3 weeks old. By the time you get to the next year in a new lambing, don't think I'm going to see it in 3-week-old lambs. It won't be till more like 5 or 6 week old lambs at the start of lambing, 3-week-old lambs by the end of lambing, because of this build up of the challenge. A susceptible lamb has had no previous exposure. A susceptible lamb is stressed, and that could be due to weather, it could be due to poor nutrition, it could be due to some other ongoing illness, for example, nematovirus. Something else that it makes that lamb less strong is going to make it more susceptible to cocci. So how do lambs get cocci in the first place? What's the initial source? And one of the sources is from the ewes. So ewes will shed low numbers of oocysts. And there are also some oocysts that overwinter on the pasture. And my slide seems to be doing all this by itself now. So we've got small numbers from the ewes, and we've got some oocysts on the pasture. All young lambs have good protection up to 4 weeks old, but as they start taking in oocysts, they shed loads. So there's a massive multiplier. They take in these low numbers and then they shed millions. But those young lambs are building up immunity with it. So I've tried to show immunity with how strong a ewe is. Very immune, age-acquired immunity. That's why she's dark green. And a lamb is a pale green because they hardly have any immunity, but their immunity increases with exposure. So they go to a dark green because they're shedding loads, but they're also getting more immune. So that's why early on in the season, cocci is not necessarily so much of a problem, because as the lambs are shedding oocysts, they're also getting immunity. If we then move those older immune lambs out of that field and leave the contaminated field, the oocysts there, and move younger lambs into this field, these younger naive lambs pick up that huge challenge, and they are really susceptible to disease. And that's where you see bad deaths due to cocci, when you've moved young susceptible lambs into a field that older lambs have already built up massive contamination. That's a huge risk factor. And then the other type of risk is if the lambs have had no exposure at all until they're older than 4 weeks old. So we've said there's a small number from the ewes, we've said there's a small amount overwintering in the pasture. This is a small number of cocci going into the lambs. That's a good way for the lamb to get immunity. However, the worst case of cocci I've seen is a farm where he had very, very clean conditions in the shed, and he kept his lambs in the shed for 4 weeks, really impeccably clean conditions, but they had had no exposure at all. And then he moved them out onto fields that were contaminated, and he saw dramatic deaths because they hadn't had this exposure until they were older than 4 weeks. The other really dramatic situation I've seen that in is in Canada, where they treat the ewes with anti-coccidiostats. They're often housed for months because of the cold conditions, but the lambs had no cocci exposure at all, and sometimes they were turning them out at 7-8 months old, and they're seeing cocci deaths in lambs then. We never see that in the UK because they've had some exposure, and if we're going to see cocci deaths, it's in 1, 2, 3 month old lambs. That was a really unusual situation, and it was because they were so paranoid about cocci that they were treating not only ewes but neonatal lambs as well. The lambs just had no exposure at all. So that's just worth bearing in mind. Natural immunity is really important. So we don't cross protection or immunity. It's only by that species of cocci. So if they've got immunity to Crandalis, and then you somehow mix a flock, or you put them in a different field where actually there's now Ovinondalis and not Crandalis, the lambs are only going to have immunity to the species that they've been exposed to as a young stage. So that's quite important. And then this just summarizes the risk factors. Is young lambs interfere where old lambs have been. That's massively important. Prolonged period of very clean housing before they're turned out onto contaminated pastures. That's very important. And then the other situation is where people have maybe had young lambs on medicated creep, and then that's suddenly withdrawn. They haven't got any immunity, and then you can see a cocci problem from that. So those are, I would suggest, are the 3 most serious cases where we see clinical coccidiosis. I'm just going to quickly talk about the research behind this. This was actually done back in the 1970s, but they maybe it was the 80s actually, but anyway, it wasn't published until 1989, and it was quite interesting because they noticed that they had better survival rates in lambs that were actually in quite dirty lambing conditions, and they couldn't quite work out why. And it was down at the RVC. Basically, what they discovered was, if a lamb up to 4 days old, so from 0 to 4 days old, if they fed high levels of pathogenic cocci, there were no clinical signs at that very young age. And then if they then gave cocci to a 6-week-old lamb that had been exposed at less than 4 days old, this animal was really immune and there was no disease at all. If they didn't expose lambs to cocci until they were older than 4 days old, but less than 4 weeks, so between 4 days and 4 weeks old, they fed pathogenic cocci. They got some diarrhea and they were a little bit ill. That's made it go a bit yellow. But these pre-exposed lambs, when they then gave them some more cocci at 6 weeks old, there was no further disease. So a lamb between 4 days and 4 weeks old did get a bit ill from the cocci, but they were then solidly immune by 6 weeks old. If they didn't expose those lambs at all until they were over 4 weeks old, so this is a completely naive lamb, if they then fed pathogenic cocci at 6 weeks old, this lamb got extremely ill, really bad. And what it showed is, actually, exposure at less than 4 days old is really important in future protecting those lambs. Now, that's quite a hard message because we don't want people to have dirty lambing pens, and we don't, because for all sorts of other reasons. But what it does mean is actually potentially in the future, and I'd like to think in the next 10, 20, whatever is 30 years, that we might have a vaccine against cocci, which would be brilliant. And just to say that there is a research project going on at the moment, potential long-term looking at vaccine development, and Ben from Farm Postmortems is currently actively looking for clinical cases of cocci. So if you're a vet or a farmer, you've got clinical cocci on your farm, and you can collect some samples, send them to Ben. Let us know, take down that number or that email. He would be delighted to receive your cocci samples. So send your poo to Ben. But what they're doing is, so they're basically genotyping the cocci and working out whether they can use it as a vaccine candidate. I mean, it's really, really early stage research, but it's exactly what they do in chicks. Day-old chicks are vaccinated against cocci. So that's a different type of cocci, it's a different species, but maybe one day in the future we'll be able to do that for lambs, and we won't need to then treat. But you know, that's slightly pie in the sky for the moment. So back to what we can do here and now. Risk assessment is really key for cocci. So I tried to explain that at the beginning for which lambs are most susceptible. And so this risk assessment, I like people to think about each separate group of lambs. So never think of a flock as, you know, one group of 600 ewes and 900 lambs. That it is never actually like that. You've got batches, you've got ewes that land in a certain place, go out into a certain field. Each set of lambs, you want to have quite close cohorts and think about them slightly differently. So for each different group of lambs, you're thinking, have we diagnosed pathogenic coccidiosis in lambs in this field in a previous year? And if you have, and you know it's positive, you know, tick the red box. That's pretty significant. If you have and it's negative, well, that's quite reassuring. Then have you done speciation? Do you know that you've got ovinodalis or crandalis present? That's quite relevant. Or has a vet done a post-mortem of a lamb and shown cocci to be the cause of death? If the answer to any of those questions is yes, then that's really significant, and you're ticking a box in the red. You know, you're thinking, I have got to do something about cocci on this farm. If you've not done any of those tests, then you're still in that I don't quite know. If you've done those tests and you're negative, then you've got a bit more reassurance that you're not so much at risk. But it's very definite that different groups of lambs are potentially a different status, and it's really helpful to understand what that status is for what your different groups of lambs are. And then you're also saying, have we got clinical signs? Do we have diarrhea or scar in any of those lambs? Are some of them really straining to pass feces? Are they looking stary coat? Have they got abdominal pain? Are they dehydrated? Is there any other unexplained death? And any one of those could point to cocci. It's not necessarily definite, but it's possible that cocci is present. And then we've also got subclinical signs as well. So anything that's not growing well up to weaning, if you're weighing lambs, I'm a really, really strong advocate for people weighing lambs at 6 to 8 weeks handling. Weigh lambs then and weigh them again at weaning is such valuable information on a sheep farm to know how my lamb's doing. Even if you only weigh 20 lambs in the flock, you're getting an idea of what your growth rates are. And I think what's been a massive failing on our sheep farms is we've always weighing lambs has not been a routine thing, and when people have started doing it, it becomes a bit compulsive. And actually we can see it's really interesting to see how growth rates change in lambs, and it can be really, really helpful to know nutrition, to give an idea of how well the ewes are milking, but it can also be really helpful for subclinical signs of coccidiosis. And the other thing is, are there lots of lambs left on the farm? You know, the key time for lambs to grow, the most important time is 0 to 6 weeks. So a lamb that's doing well at 6-7 weeks old is a lamb that's going to be off the farm quickly. If a lamb is trailing in growth rates or lighter size at that 6 to 8 week weigh-in, then those lambs are going to be lighter at weaning. Those are the lambs that are going to be on the farm longer. They're the problem ones. And the way the whole sheep industry works with pricing, the quicker you can get lambs away. If you can get your lambs away 10, 11, 12 weeks, those early lambs, the price is still really good. As they go on, if you've got lambs that you're selling them all September, October, they're necessarily going to be at the lowest price. Recently, the pricing has been a bit extreme in the last couple of years, but the picture is always the same. We always get much better prices June, July, and by September, October, the price is at its lowest. So that's very significant. And then you also want to be talking about management practices on the farm. So are you housing using lambs for a long period before turnout? That's a high risk. Are you putting younger lambs in a field where there were older lambs? Very high risk. are lambs in the shed able to defecate into their water or feed trough, so that other lambs are expected to drink water that's been contaminated by other lambs? That's very important. And then this business about no cross protection between the pathogenic species. Are you putting young lambs in a field that were used by a different flock that you don't know what their status is? That may be relevant. And so that's my sort of risk assessment that I go through on a farm, and I would expect a vet to go through. Obviously, vets will be thinking about, there's not just cocci causing scouring in lambs. Nematodaris is a massive differential diagnosis, and I've got a slide on nematodaris next. But there could be a dietary form of scour. It could be that you've just put some creep out there, and the lambs have just, just gone ballistic on overdosing on a bit of creep. That's going to cause a bit of scour. Or it's suddenly rained and there's been a massive flush of grass and the lambs aren't quite used to it. That could cause a dietary scour. There could be a cobalt deficiency. You often see scour with that. Usually you see it at the older ones. You don't usually see the signs of cobalt deficiency until they're weaned. They've got to be a ruminant to see cobalt deficiency. You never see it in pre-ruminant. You'd start to see the signs from when they're properly eating grass, so from 8 weeks, but you don't definitely see it until they're more likely weaned. Bacterial scour, particularly in the younger ones, I've seen Campylobacter in young lambs, really horrible yellow scour, very quick to finish off lambs at about 10 days, 2 weeks old, really nasty. Cryptosporidia is also really important, particularly in pet lambs. So that's an important differential. Later on, again, after nematodaris has been a problem, other parasitic worms, nematodes, trichostrongars are important to consider. And then a bit unusual, but a toxicity, whether it's acorn poisoning or an ingestion of fertilizer or something, any of those could cause a scour, and kind of at the back of your mind. Probably not top of the list, but at the back of your mind. But the one that is top of your list is nematodaris. So nematodaris is worm. It's particularly, lambs are particularly susceptible between 6 and 12 weeks old. It's all to do with the weather. I'm not going to go into nematodaris in detail now. That's a whole nother talk. But if we get a sudden hatch of infective larvae on a pasture that had either lambs or calves on the previous year, and if that hatch coincides with susceptible 6 to 12 week old lambs, we can see nematodaris deaths. It's really important to keep an eye on the forecast. It's the immature stages of nematodaris that kill the lambs. You can't wait till you start to see nematodaris eggs in the feces. By the time you see nematodaris eggs in the feces, that means you've got adult nematodaris worms in the gut, but nematodaris will kill the lambs before those worms have reached adult stage. The immatures kill the lambs. So dead lambs is the first thing you see. And nematodaris and cocci, I would say, are often confused for each other. So often you see them together, but quite often someone will think they've got nematodaris, but actually it's cocci, or the other way around. So a diagnosis, proper diagnosis, either a post-mortem or proper looking at samples is really important. This study was just done in Norway, and basically it was lambs that were housed until day 0 of the study, and then they just turned them out onto naturally contaminated pastures. And this just shows a difference of lambs that had no treatments at all, lambs that were just given an anthelmintic for nematodaris, lambs that were given toltrazurol for coccidiosis, and lambs that were given both. And it just shows that there was they lost lambs from cocci in the groups that were given the anthelmintic but not given the cocci treatment, the toltrazurol, and they lost lambs from nematodaris in the groups that were given toltrazurol but no anthelmintic. It's quite extreme to have clinical cocci and nematodaris like that. Clearly those lambs needed treatment for both conditions, but that's, and this is just a published study which actually looked into detail, and we can kind of go through the finer detail. It's worth saying, definitely not every single farm has to treat every single lamb for both cocci and nematodaris. But if you've got either or both, you definitely do have to treat. So you really need to be on it with diagnosis. So what do we do about coccidiosis? The most important thing is to understand the disease. So we've been going through that. What are the risk factors? How do they affect management on the farm? But you also have to understand the farm. So this little map here, so here's a driveway up to the farm. These are where they lamb. And basically looking through the farm map is really useful. So what happens here is they're turning out of the lambing shed and they're putting twins into here. Then as soon as that field's full of twins, they'll move them on into this field, and they'll put young lambs into here, and they'll put some of these into this field. And then when these are all busy, they'll then move them onto this field. You can see straight away from what we said before, this is a massively high risk for cocci in the youngest lamb. By the time the older lambs are over in this field, the youngest ones are coming in here. This is massive contamination because of the way cocci works. So at the beginning of the season, it wasn't. Beginning of the season, there were a few oocysts less from previous year. There were a few oocysts from the ewes passing oocysts. The first lot of lambs, that was no problem. They had a small cocci challenge, and they built immunity with it. But their nice immunity, they're now over in this field. But they have contaminated this field, and younger lambs going in there, this farm in this system will have massive issues with coccidiosis by later on in lambing. And actually talking through which fields are at risk and how can he change that. Actually, can he do something a bit cleverer and do a bit more set stocking, so with different cohorts of lambs, or should he put in place treatment of the later lambs as they're coming into this field? Personally, I would do a combination of both. And I would always, whether you've got an organic farm or not, you always want to do what you can management-wise before you turn to the medicines, because we all know that however good the medicines are, they cost, and there's a limited lifespan for any medicines, however brilliant they are. So if you can do something with where he puts the lambs in which fields first, that's a better idea. He probably will still need to use some sort of medication. Third most important thing is to get a diagnosis. And the most useful way to do that is to take samples, like pool samples from a batch of about a dozen lambs, and ask the lab to speciate them as well as give you a count. So a count is one thing, but there's always lots of cocci there. 13 out of the 15 species of cocci are not pathogenic, and there's no problem with it at all. So just a cocci count is actually not that helpful. Speciation and knowing that you've got ovinoidalis or crandalis present is really important. So I always like to get a sample and pool it. Incidentally, if you're sending samples to Ben, he's okay with a pooled sample. He'd actually prefer individual samples if you can do that. So how useful is a cocci count? A very high count might be non-pathogenic species, I've already said. A very low count doesn't necessarily mean you're in the clear. So it may be that you're in very early stage of the disease and you've got immature cocci, they're causing a lot of damage, they're not yet laying a load of eggs, so you haven't yet got a load of oocysts. So you might still need to treat with cocci even though the count is low. If there's a very heavy challenge, you might have got so much gut tissue damaged that the cocci can't actually keep developing. The lamb is in a really extreme state then, but actually a very sick lamb, very damaged gut, actually the cocci has kind of damaged the gut so much we're not actually going to get so many oocysts out. That lamb's in a bad state. And much later on in disease, once the lamb's sort of getting through it, it may well be that there's so much damage to the gut that there aren't many oocysts. So a count tells you something, but actually it probably doesn't tell you a lot either. And so for that reason, I would always recommend getting speciation if you possibly can. I've got some results here that we looked at. This was actually a few years ago now. So we analysed these results in 2016. We presented the paper at the International Sheep Vets Conference in Harrogate in 2017. And we basically, there was a scheme going where pooled samples were taken from lambs from UK flocks between 2012 and 2016. You can see this is literally how many samples were sent in by the vets. So exactly as you would expect, most people are lambing February, March, April. Most cases of Cocci, April, May, June. Dramatic increase in submissions. This is literally just submissions, but for those 5 years, the pattern was pretty much similar. By the time you got to August, the submissions massively tailed off, and we didn't see loads of Cocci in these later samples. Looking at age, to be fair, as vets were filling in the form, they probably used 8 weeks as a kind of as a bit of a guess, which is why we've got quite so many at 8 weeks, but they were largely 8-week-old lambs. There were a few much older lambs, and they were still finding some pathogenic Cocci, although to be honest, in these ons up to 12 weeks it might have been clinical. Above that, certainly up here in the, this is unlikely to be clinical Cocci, although it might still be an indication of previous subclinical disease. And then I just thought this was quite useful to put in. So Cocci counts, people panic very quickly with Cocci counts, just to show that actually 50,000 is pretty low when it comes to a Cocci count. This here we're up to 350,000, and just to show by the year, this is on a logarithmic scale, and the counts, and I can't quite explain why 2012 were significantly less than other years, but you can see there were a significant number right up between 100,000 and 1 million oocysts per gram. So just be prepared that in comparison with fecal egg counts for worms, where we're looking at 400, 500 being significant and 1,000 being massive, when you're talking about Cocci, 1,000 is irrelevant, and actually 10,000 to 40,000 is more likely where you might be. But as we've already said, a very high count does not mean it's pathogenic necessarily. It just means you've got a lot of Cocci there. They may be non-pathogenic. So just a reminder, if you have got clinical samples this year, please, please, please send them to Ben. He's really keen to get samples in, and you might be part of, maybe in 20 years time, there will be a vaccine against Cocci in lambs, and sending samples in now will contribute to that. So that'd be really helpful. So back to what do we do about Cocci? We've talked about understanding disease. We've talked about understanding the farm. We talked about getting a diagnosis. So the last thing is using targeted medication where it's necessary. First off, I don't like medicating ewes. I don't think it is a good idea. Most importantly, because ewes are not affected by Cocci. So to medicate the ewes, so sometimes people put out decock buckets for the ewes. That's certainly what some of these farms in Canada were doing. I think that was really, really contributed to there being worse Cocci in the lambs because the ewes were medicated. I cannot see any rationale behind medicating ewes. So just stopping the ewe shedding, it doesn't remove all the oocysts because we still got some overwintered. Even in Canada, it winters at a -40 below, they still have oocysts overwintered. A winter doesn't get rid of oocysts. Medicating ewes doesn't make any difference at all. And we know very, very clearly from that work done at the RVC back in the 1980s, there are definite benefits of very young lambs having access to low levels of Cocci because we need them to build immunity. If you've medicated the ewes, you've decreased the chances of a very young lamb having access to some Cocci. So you're going to make the problem worse. So I've said that it may well increase the risk of lambs not having any exposure until they're turned out. So for that reason, I absolutely think medicating ewes is a bad idea. So what about in-feed medication for the lambs? And it is possible to use decoquinate for the lambs. It's really important that you do the maths right and work out, it's a complicated calculation of the amount of decoquinate you need per lamb and how much of the premix you need to put in the creep feed, etc., etc. It's not my favorite way of treating lambs. Personally, I don't like it. Because a lamb needs to eat a significant amount of that creep to kill the cocci. And if the lamb is already sick, maybe for another reason, e.g. Novantidaris, it won't have the appetite, so it won't eat the creep, then it makes it more at risk of the cocci. So for that reason, I don't think it's a good idea. And secondarily, it's only active in the small intestine, whereas we know that cocci is a problem in the small and the large intestine. So we might get lambs that are on creep, but they're still shedding oocysts. So it may stop the clinical signs. A number of farmers like it because it's kind of easy. I personally don't. I don't think it's targeted enough, and it wouldn't be my best. It wouldn't be the best way to treat them as far as I'm concerned. It certainly is a definite problem if you had them on creep and then you remove that medicated creep, then you've got potentially a massive risk in those lambs. So you can go with targeted medication, and then you've got a choice between diclosural or toltrazuril. So each one is a dose rate of 1 mils per 2.5 kilograms of lamb, and they're useful in, I think they're useful in two situations. So one is in the face of an outbreak, you treat that whole group. So immediately that you diagnose cocci in a single lamb, you use either product to all lambs that are over 3 weeks old in that group. And just note that you might be important if you're using diclosural to use it again after 3 weeks. It doesn't have the same duration of action. The other time it's useful is if you're expecting a high challenge. So this might be that you've tested on the farm previously, you might have done that risk assessment, you might have done a lot of ticks in the red boxes, and you are expecting a high cocci challenge in this group, in which case you want to go in for lambs that are not yet showing clinical disease, but you know they're going to be exposed to a high level of cocci. Then the timing is critical. Timing is especially critical if you're using diclosural, because there's no residual and you definitely can't give it on the day of turnout. You've got to turn them into a dirty pasture and then be absolutely religious about giving your diclosural between day 10 and 14. If you wait till longer than day 14, you'll have dead lambs, and you give it before day 10 after turnout, it won't be working by the time they need it. So you must give it between day 10 and 14, and you may well need to give a second dose 3 weeks later. If you're using toltrazuril, the timing is less critical because it's got a longer duration of action. Give it from 3 weeks old, or give it a week before you expect the challenge. That's from 3 weeks old is probably the easiest way to do it. But if you know you've housed them for 4 weeks and then you're expecting a challenge, a week before that challenge is when to give it. We know that whichever product you use, those lambs will shed fewer eggs, they'll have less diarrhea, they'll grow faster. And we know that lambs treated with 1 dose of toltrazuril shed fewer eggs than lambs treated with either 1 or 2 doses of diclosural. I've got a few graphs to just show that in some studies. So this study was in Germany. It's looking on the y-axis, we've got the median numbers of eggs per gram output. Basically, there were 4 different groups. The M at the beginning means these were treated metaphylactically. So these, either with toltrazuril or diclosural, were treated on day 12 after exposure. So the graph starts at day 12. And then the T, these were treated within 2 days of them excreting oocysts. So these were treated at this stage, day 21. What it shows is, the blue is the control. So these animals had none at all. And by day 19, I think, they start putting out eggs. So by 3 weeks after exposure, they're putting out, the control animals are putting out a load of eggs, or the blue bars. The two red bars are either whether they were treated with diclosural on day 12 is the pale, or day 21 is a dark red. You can see that they're given the treatment, the diclosural, and then within the next 10, 15 days, they start shedding eggs. And that happens whichever method. You can't see the dark red so much, but you can see they start shedding eggs quite significantly. And that's why we say you may well have to give another treatment of diclosural after 3 weeks to prevent this shed. The toltrasural treated lambs, whether it was on day 12 or day 21, they didn't start shedding eggs, the tiny number at the end of 7 weeks, with the ones that weren't treated day 12. So that just shows you on shedding eggs. If you're looking on, this is again on oocyst output. These were some lambs. I think this was in Italy, I think. It was in Italy or Spain, 170 lambs. Basically, each T, it represents a week, and they looked at a single dose of toltrasural versus a single dose of diclosural, versus the controls were a dose of water, which clearly had no impact at all. So from within a week or two, the ones given water were putting out a load of eggs. The ones given diclosural didn't start shedding eggs until about week 3, but then they shed about the same as the ones on water. And the ones given toltrasural didn't shed eggs for 9 weeks on a single dose. So that's on egg output. There's also studies to show the efficacy of toltrasural and diclosural on medication. This is exactly the same study, same one in Italy, and it's looking at, it says mobility, I think it means morbidity. It's basically clinical signs. The ones on toltrasural, there were no clinical signs at all. The ones on diclosural, it sort of matches the egg output quite neatly, and the ones on water showed quite significant signs. So those are just some of the studies that show the difference between the treatments. And I suppose in summary, it would be to say that if you are, I'm just going to flick back to these two slides here. When you use treatment, is either group treatment in the face of an outbreak. So somebody is diagnosed clinical coccidiosis in a single lamb, then get on and give targeted treatment immediately to everything over 3 weeks old within that group. And if you're using diclosural, repeat it after 3 weeks. And the other case is if you've done your risk assessment and you know you've got a high challenge, then get on and give a treatment, and either be really specific with timing with diclosural and potentially repeat after 3 weeks, or use toltrasural and either give from 3 weeks old or a week before the challenge. And that sort of summarizes it.